I have the pleasure of introducing the next panel. The next panel is entitled The Whole Landscape, Managing Beyond Traditional Boundaries, which is something we understand in Montana with our BLM, Forest Service, private, railroad land grant, reservation lands. Did I leave anything out? Anything else? Without further ado, Matthew McKinney of the Public Policy Research of the Institute at the University of Montana will be introducing the panel here.
Thanks, Michael. As the director of the Policy Institute, I likewise want to just extend my appreciation and thanks to all of the law students, beginning with Mike and Jen, for the terrific job that they've done in organizing and convening the conference, all the law faculty and the dean for providing support to make this happen, and also to my colleague, Sarah Bates, who's really done a terrific amount of work and effort in helping organize, focus, and bring different speakers here to the conference. So we're off and running. The focus of this next panel is, as you can see here, the whole landscape, managing beyond traditional boundaries. So I want to spend a couple of minutes kind of setting this up and then introducing our distinguished panel members. So the question might arise in your mind, sort of why the whole landscape and what exactly do we mean by this when we talk about landscapes. I think it's appropriate to sort of look back historically and perhaps begin with John Wesley Powell's vision. As most of you know, Powell was a Civil War veteran and surveyed the American West, and then in 1890 he wrote a book and several articles and effectively argued that the most appropriate institutions for governing Western land and natural resources are commonwealths defined by watershed. He reasoned, and I quote, "There's a body of interdependent and unified interests and values, all collected in a hydrographic basin, and all segregated by well-defined boundary lines from the rest of the world. The people in such a district have common interests, common rights, common duties, and must necessarily work together for common purposes." Well, suffice it to say, it's a terrific vision, and it's, in many respects, we're moving in that direction, but historically we didn't quite get there. This is a map of states and counties in the West, and a map of the federal lands estate in the West, okay? So in and of itself, why does that matter? And I think we've already heard last night and this morning that it matters because so many of the issues we're confronted with in the West and on the public lands are issues that cut across these traditional boundaries, from climate change to energy development, and the list of issues that have already been talked about last night and this morning. So there's a very clear and compelling reason to sort of think about how are we going to work across these different boundaries. We've, over the years at the Policy Institute, have had the opportunity of working with the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy to focus on what we call regional collaboration, which is really all about how, in fact, regions, communities, people in the public and private sector, in fact, come together to do this kind of work across boundaries and to tackle some of these issues. And we sort of laid this out in terms of defining the elements of the puzzle in the following way, that first of all, there's a sort of a basic mismatch, which is to say that the territory of the problems or the issues that we're interested in transcend the existing geography, the geography of existing institutions as well as policies. Secondly, there's a set of interdependent interests that no single entity has the power or the authority to address the problem on their own. And so that sets up what we see, and sort of the way we think about this is fundamentally a gap in governance. That the scale and the role of government is inadequate to address these problems, that there's in essence a lack of public space, if you will, to share power and responsibility. Well, let me just sort of illustrate this with the Crown of the Continent, which is actually some work that we're currently doing. A number of people are familiar with the Crown of the Continent as one of these large, intact landscapes and ecosystems. The Crown is most of us know is sort of anchored by Glacier and Waterton National Parks there. This is what it looks like. It's in terms of a landscape without borders, okay? The reality is it's been cut up, and if you sort of watch this slide unfold, it'll show you the different, one more click, the different jurisdictions that have some responsibility, authority, different missions and mandates to manage and take care of, again, this very large intact landscape. And so it sort of begs the question of how, in fact, do we get these different agencies, these different entities, and these are all the public ones. It doesn't really include, it does some of the white area is private land, but it doesn't necessarily include all the communities. So how, in fact, you know, if we're concerned about trying to maintain, sustain this intact landscape or ecosystem, how, in fact, do we begin to bring all these people together? And what we're going to do this morning is we've got a terrific panel to address this issue, both sort of historically and also from some different perspectives. So what I want to do is introduce the panel members all at once right now, and then we'll have them get up and speak for about 20 to 25 minutes each. And then hopefully we've got 20 minutes or so for questions and discussion. Bob Kiter is going to lead off and talk about sort of experiments on the public lands in terms of ecosystem management and landscape conservation. Bob is the Wallace Stegner Distinguished Professor of Law and Director of the Wallace Stegner Center for Land, Resources, and the Environment at the University of Utah. His most recent book, Keeping Faith with Nature, Ecosystems, Democracy, and America's Public Land, looks in depth at a number of these experiments that he's going to talk to us about this morning. Following Bob will be John Dorson. John just recently retired as the Assistant Chief Administrative Law Judge with the California Public Utilities Commission in San Francisco, where he concentrated on water cases, adjudication, and alternative dispute resolution. Much of his career has been devoted to Missouri River water issues and Indian water rights, and he continues his involvement in those issues. He now serves as co-chair of a large consensus-building process sponsored by the U.S. Institute for Environmental Conflict Resolution to develop a charter for permanent endangered species recovery committee for the Missouri River. So John is going to sort of move beyond a focus specifically on public land and sort of reflect on what lessons we might learn from the experiences in managing transboundary river basins and watershed, and see if there's something that we can learn that might be helpful in the public lands context. Then last but certainly not least, Jan Brown is the Executive Director for the Yellowstone Business Partnership. She's been there for 5 years, 6 years, since 2003. After 27 years of involvement in conservation in Idaho, since her start at the Yellowstone Business Partnership, she's united over 250 businesses dedicated to preserving a healthy environment and sharing a prosperous and sustainable future for communities in the 25 counties surrounding Yellowstone and Grand Teton National Parks. Prior to coming to the Yellowstone Business Partnership, she was Executive Director of the Henry Sport Foundation in Idaho from '91 to 2000, and that included 7 years as co-facilitator of the Henry Sport Watershed Council. So Jan is going to, again, sort of shift gears and focus and reflect on the role of the private sector and non-government organizations in helping facilitate, promote, and otherwise support these regional transboundary approaches to public land management. So I look forward to some great presentations and some discussion. Bob, want to get us started?
Thank you, Matt, and it's my pleasure to be here, and let me extend my thanks to the students with the Public Land and Resources Law Review who played a key role in organizing this conference and have done so for 30-some years now. I think that's quite a testament to the College of Law's commitment to this public land law conference. I also would like to acknowledge the role of Sarah and Matt in organizing the conference and their contributions to this. The sort of hidden contribution that Matt made is perhaps not quite as evident. He called me up and wanted me to participate on the program and knew something about my background, which included teaching constitutional law for 30 years. So in a very lawyer-like and astute fashion, he got me here by starting the conversation with, you've taught constitutional law for all these years, haven't you, Bob? Yes. Well, what do you think about the First Amendment? And what could a constitutional law teacher say in response to that other than, I'm all for free speech? To which he replied, how about giving one? So you got me here. But the talk will not be about the First Amendment. I apologize if some of you heard that before. I have a hard time getting jokes and speaking, so I thought I'd take advantage of that. I also should add that the draft of this National Advisory Board report that's in the materials that you have is very much a work in progress. So comments are in order, and we've already heard some suggestions from speakers today. My charge here today, as Matt suggested, is to make the case for regionalism or ecosystem management on the public lands. Let me underline that. And to describe what that means and some of the experiences that we've had with it. As Matt noted, and I thank him for the promotion, I'll do it myself unapologetically, Keeping Faith with Nature tries to address the evolution of the concept of ecological management. And for what it's worth, there's a recent Law Journal article that I prepared that is sort of a sequel to the book. I'll draw a little bit from this today too in my remarks, entitled Breaking Faith with Nature, the Bush Administration and Public Land Policy. Let me, as I turn to the subject at hand, let me also note that under tab E, I think it is, in the materials that you have, I have a brief sort of topical outline. That's the sequence in which this talk will unfold. I won't describe it further than that at this point. Quick word about terminology. The concept ecosystem management was in vogue during most of the Clinton administration, evolving over time into ecosystem-based management. Other terms have come to the fore: regionalism, the title of this session, landscape scale conservation or management. We've also heard integrated and adaptive management as terms of art to sort of describe the idea of managing our public lands and resources at some sort of appropriate ecological scale. I'll use the term ecosystem management as the term for the talk. I don't know that that's necessarily the term that will carry the day over time, but it works for me. I won't go into reasons as to why at this point. I don't think the term is that important. The concept is much more important. The case for regionalism, I think that's been made already, and I don't want to spend my time or your time making it further. Matt's opening presentation, I think, suggested many of the problems that transcend traditional jurisdictional boundaries, and Karen's earlier talk also focused on biodiversity conservation. I think helps to make that case also very well, and in particular the role of the public lands in promoting large-scale biodiversity conservation efforts. Add to that climate change and the related adaptation and mitigation strategies, and I think there's even a stronger case today. This isn't necessarily new. It didn't emerge in the 1990s. Very briefly, if you go back at least into the 1970s, with the crisis that Redwoods National Park faced in California with the upstream logging, and the response to that, we began to see and understand the sort of connections between trying to promote conservation on public lands and adjacent landscapes, whether they were publicly or privately owned. That evolved into a 1980 threats to the national parks report that also in turn evolved into threats to national wildlife refuges emerging. About this time, the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem concept began to gather some legs, and eventually the Greater Yellowstone Coordinating Committee stepped forward and during the late 1980s undertook a vision process. More about that later. Finally, sort of the culmination, I think, of federal public land ecosystem management efforts is reflected in the adoption of the Northwest Forest Plan that in turn then fostered a slew of additional sort of large-scale ecological management efforts by the Clinton administration. So what is this concept of landscape scale management or regionalism? There were a number of definitions that surfaced during the 1990s. Let me just read one, which was the Federal Interagency Ecosystem Management Task Force definition, which says that an ecosystem approach is a method for sustaining or restoring natural systems and their functions and values. It is goal-driven and it is based on a collaboratively developed vision of desired future conditions that integrates ecological, economic, and social factors. It is applied within a geographic framework defined primarily by ecological boundaries. There were a number of other definitions, more or less the same, many reflecting sort of the particular predisposition of whoever the proponent of the definition was that emerged during that period of time. In keeping faith with nature, I tried to synthesize this down into what I described as 6 governing principles for ecological management. Let me share those to you also to help sort of frame the discussion. First, to ensure healthy natural resource systems and to address pressing species extinction concerns, a primary goal of ecosystem management is to maintain and restore biodiversity and sustainable ecosystems. Second, because people are a part of nature and human values inform any natural resource policy, ecosystem management goals must be socially defined, ordinarily through broad public participation to incorporate ecological, economic, and social concerns into workable sustainability strategies. Third, because species and ecological processes transcend jurisdictional boundaries, ecosystem management requires coordination among federal agencies and collaboration with state, local, and tribal governments, as well as opportunities for public involvement in planning and decision processes. Fourth, given the dynamic, non-equilibrium nature of ecosystems and the unpredictability of related disturbance processes, ecosystem management requires management on broad spatial and temporal scales in order to accommodate ecological change and to address multiple rather than single resources. Fifth, given the important role science plays in understanding natural systems, ecosystem management is based on integrated, interdisciplinary, and current scientific information that can be used to address risk and uncertainty. And sixth, because ecosystem management and the accompanying science are still experimental, ecosystem management requires an adaptive management approach that includes establishing baseline conditions, monitoring, reevaluation, and adjustment to reflect changes in scientific knowledge as well as evolving human concerns. That's my effort to sort of capture this, and obviously it's not a soundbite other than the concept of ecological management or ecological sustainability itself, but it gives you a sense of what I think people have been talking about and attempting to accomplish. This, as I noted, really came to the fore, I think, during the Clinton years, and emerged largely through executive level actions promoting both ecological management and a collaborative type of conservation agenda. The Bush administration really hasn't picked up on ecosystem management as such, but it certainly has pursued what has been termed a cooperative conservation agenda, a dimension of, I think, ecological management as we'll understand it. A quick comparison between the two approaches I think is worthwhile. Let me just share what I think are some of the highlights, if you will, of the Clinton approach. It was pretty heavy federal involvement in ecological management, a good deal of top-down emphasis and focus that is driven from the top down. The emphasis was clearly on landscape scale efforts. Read Bruce Babbitt's book, Cities in the Wilderness, and I think that comes through loud and clear. There was a real priority given to biodiversity conservation, ecosystem health, and an effort to foster broadly inclusive collaborative conservation efforts. Some quick examples of these sorts of characteristics. The revised Forest Service planning rules that emerged during that era, the National Forest Area Rule adopted by the Clinton, Roadless Area Rule, excuse me, adopted by the Clinton administration, the expansive new BLM national monuments, and the revised resource advisory councils under the revised rangeland regulations during the Clinton years for the BLM. The Bush administration took a different tack. The focus, as I suggested, was on the 4 C's and cooperative conservation, keystone of Secretary Norton's agenda. Underlying this was the sense that, yes, we need to do conservation on the landscape, but it makes sense to approach it from the bottom rather than the top. The emphasis here was on local control and on property rights. Little emphasis on landscape scale conservation initiatives, and the jargon of ecosystem management largely, but not entirely, dropped out of federal agency vocabulary. And there was an effort, a clear effort, to move away from rigid sort of standards governing management by the federal agencies. This is reflected, for example, in the revised Forest Service planning rules, that is the Bush administration's revisions there. Also, the devolutionary aspects reflected in the state petition process for Forest Service roadless area protection. I ultimately concluded in this sequel article that I mentioned that the agenda of the Bush administration of public lands was captured in, I sort of had to draw upon this kind of academic phrase, the 3 Ds. Those 3 Ds are development, devolution, and delegalization. Having said that, I think important to note that the basic statutory legal framework that set the stage for the Clinton initiatives is still in place. Congress hasn't changed any of the major laws governing the public lands. With that said, let me very quickly, if I can, share with you a few observations, what I call observations from the field, in keeping faith with nature, and to some degree since then, I've tried to keep track of what's major landscape scale initiatives, and here's some very quick observations about several of those. They're noted, again, in the brief outline you have in your handouts. The Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. The Greater Yellowstone Coordinating Committee actually came into being in the mid-1960s. Really didn't do much until this vision process that I alluded to in the 1980s. That was driven by a combination of a report to Congress saying the bears were about to be lost, you need to do something, and you can't do it by management in the traditional boundary-based manner. The 1988 fires really brought home the problems with boundary-based management, and that ecology was a major factor in that landscape, and a variety of advocacy groups, in particular the Greater Yellowstone Coalition, really promoted the idea of managing this area as an ecosystem. We had, and that in turn led the federal agencies to undertake a vision process that ultimately collapsed after a pretty visionary document came out, but public hearings really that were held around the region really sort of undercut that and suggested there was far from a consensus locally for moving ahead with this sort of approach to the region. Since then, there really hasn't been any sort of major effort on a grand scale to coordinate, collaborate management. On individual issues, yes, but not on the grand scale. The second effort I alluded to earlier, the Northwest Forest Plan. Most of you know something of the history of that. I think important points here are that this emerged out of a federal court injunction that stopped timber harvesting in the Northwest on the public forests and BLM lands there. Ultimately we saw the President's Northwest Forest Plan come out of an interesting, secretive federal agency process. The the FEMAC, Federal Ecosystem Management Assessment Team, that came up with a plan and implemented it with modest public involvement at the end of the day, and ultimately secured the court's blessing there. This plan obviously is still evolving. There have been efforts to change it, some successful, some unsuccessful during the Bush years. The plan itself has a mixed record of accomplishment, but the important thing, I think, is that it's still in place, providing some guidance as to how one might move forward, but driven largely by law, injunctions, and this sort of purely federal process. We have also the Sierra Nevada Framework Plan that emerged out of a collaborative effort by all of the various national forests in the Sierra Nevada range in California. Interestingly enough, I think driven by several forces, one of which was an interest in avoiding the listing of the California spotted owl, and thus avoiding the sort of thing that happened to the north in the Pacific Northwest. Also driven by concern about wildfires and by a pretty clear evolving public consensus of what those forests were best suited for, which was not heavy-duty timber harvesting. The Quincy Library Group springs up during this period of time with its own homemade initiative covering 2.5 forests in the northern part of the Sierra Nevada, and creates a tension between a sort of locally negotiated agreement for forest management and a broader sort of mountain range-wide initiative, and putting those two plans together has proven difficult, and the Forest Service has run into some difficulty in moving forward. But the basic idea, there's more to the story than I'm able to cover here, but the basic idea is that we do see a sort of framework in place for broad-scale management there. Fourth initiative, the Interior Columbia Basin Ecosystem Management Project, involving basically the public lands, BLM and Forest Service east of the Sierra Nevada, of the Cascades, emerged in the aftermath of the Northwest Forest Plan, and was a serious effort by a number of dedicated people over a substantial period of time to try to come together around some common management framework for the area, driven by a number of different factors, including concern about the listing of the salmon, fire concerns, forest health and range health concerns. At the end of the day, it didn't work, and it collapsed. And I think a lesson there is that getting the scale right and working within a workable scale is critical to move forward with these initiatives. There's some other smaller initiatives that I allude to with mixed results: the Canyon Country Partnership, the Malpai Borderlands Group. I'd be happy to talk to you individually about each of those. They've had quite different outcomes with those initiatives. I'm just running out of time, and I can't go into that in great detail. Let me say a couple of words about the Crown of the Continent ecosystem concept that has come to the fore in this part of the country. There are actually a number of different sort of regional or landscape-focused initiatives here. and they're worth taking note of. They include the Flathead Basin Commission, which dates back to the early 1980s, if I recall correctly. The Yellowstone to Yukon initiative, which embraces the Crown area as a significant part of that effort. Northern Rockies Ecosystem Protection Act, which has been introduced into Congress a number of times and seeks significant wilderness-type protection for this area. A much smaller initiative, the Great Northern Ecosystem Stewardship area, involving the Park Service and some of the other agencies on the south side of Glacier in order to address grizzly bear issues and the Burlington Northern Railroad. And then, of course, the Crown Managers Partnership. All of these, I think, initiatives, one, speak to the logic of looking at the area as a whole, and they provide an opportunity for broader regional dialogue and an opportunity to identify common ground. The Crown Managers Partnership at this juncture seems principally to be a forum for discussion and exchange of information. Whether it will move further into addressing on-the-ground management issues, I think remains to be seen. That gives you sort of a quick overview of these initiatives. Worth also noting that we have to think beyond the boundaries of the public lands. Both John Leshy and Karen Sheldon alluded to this before. We need to think in terms of knitting together the fragmented landscape to include both public and private lands, to come up with comprehensive management arrangements, especially where we have checkerboarded landscapes. Tools to do that, exchanges, conservation easements, various financial incentives, the habitat conservation planning process under the Endangered Species Act. And as a result of some or all of these tools are being employed by a whole array of place-based collaborative conservation type initiatives that I think we'll hear more about both later in the panel and subsequently. Worth also noting that the Western Governors Association has endorsed the idea of protecting wildlife corridors. A significant step, I think, in terms of our regional political leaders that helps to knit the landscape together. So what we have, I think, in terms of thinking ahead, is that this is an evolutionary sort of process. It's occurring in the shadow of the law, often without formal endorsement or institutions. It's sort of reflective of American pragmatism, our ability to stitch things together. Joe Sachs and I took a look at the Glacier region. We actually came back after having visited it 20 years to see what was happening in that area a couple of years ago. We were particularly struck by the evolution of conservation on the Rocky Mountain front, which had gradually emerged over time for significant sort of ecological type landscape scale protections without any formal institutional structure and without much explicit federal involvement. Some of what's occurring, I think, also is reflective of emerging of agency missions. Most observers think that the law plays a significant role in moving this forward. I've tried to explain how that occurs with my remarks earlier. I'd be happy to go into some greater detail subsequently. Science plays a significant role. It really sort of sets the parameters within which management decisions might be made. Although at the end of the day, as I think all of us are aware, it's human values that are going to carry the day. Collaborative conservation processes, I think an important point of, or part of an ecological or regional management approach. It's a way of pulling people together, trying to organize them and to cultivate some sort of consensus around a shared sense of place or regional identity. We also, I think, with the various initiatives that have sprung up over time, are beginning to identify key collaborative conservation principles that need to be kept in mind with these types of initiatives. They include that they must be fair, inclusive, open or transparent, and accountable. Also worth noting that some issues may not lend themselves to collaborative conservation. I'm thinking of energy policy, for example, at least at a broad scale. Large-scale wilderness designations likewise may not lend themselves to that type of approach. The marketplace is going to affect the ability of these sorts of initiatives to move forward. Just think of what's happening in the southern part of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem with the Pinedale anticline and Jonah oil fields and the impacts that those energy development pressures have had in that area. So that's an important factor as we think about how to move forward and how to address that. I was going to read a passage, but I'm out of time from Keeping Faith with Nature. Let me conclude, though, by suggesting that if we can manage to merge the concept of ecological management with collaborative conservation, I think we're potentially poised to move forward into a new era of conservation policy on the public lands. If I can allude back to John Leshy's talk last night, I thought it was interesting that he drew upon the progressive era for his remarks. If you recall, Gifford Pinchot was a key figure in establishing conservation policy at that point in time over a century ago. That policy has basically, as I think some of our earlier speakers suggest, basically sort of run its course over this past century. One of the geniuses of Pinchot was to marry a conservation policy, one of scientific utilitarianism, if you will, with a political philosophy that was carrying the day at the time, progressivism. It took 60 years for that to be converted into law with the adoption of the Multiple Use Sustained Yield Act in 1960. I see a similar opportunity today to attempt to merge ecological management with collaborative conservation, ecological management being a new conservation vision, collaborative conservation being, if you will, an offshoot of devolutionary type political philosophy. And if we can manage to marry those two ideas together successfully, I think we're potentially poised to move into a new era with the law, which I've emphasized before, setting sideboards within which collaborative initiatives might operate. Let me emphasize, we need clear sideboards and then draw upon local initiative and knowledge to bring about a rational, functional, ecologically sustainable approach to public land management. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. The challenge there, of course, is there's a lot to say in a limited period of time. So with that, John Thorson to reflect on lessons learned from the transboundary water management.
Thank you, Matt, for your efforts in organizing this panel and for your introduction. I must admit to some discomfort hearing the word retired after my name, but if you add retired to Montana, it sounds a lot better. I am pleased to be back in the state after about 20 years of search through the West, Arizona and California. I have some unfond memories of this building. I was studying for the Montana bar in the 1980s, about 10 years after I had taken my first California bar exam. And the morning of the first day, I was having breakfast and recognized I had not studied homicide all summer long. But I muddled through the exam. Maybe I had a good answer on the waterlock question and became a member of the Montana bar. I want to join, I think, President Dennison in remembering Marge Brown at this conference. She was a terrific inspiration to the students and faculty at the University of Montana School of Law. It's hard to think of these type of gatherings in Montana without also honoring Lord Mackenzie, who, until a stroke in the 1980s, was really a leading light political scientist at Montana State, who really understood the concepts of transboundary institutions and the need to meld that with conservation strategies. I also want to recognize Jim Posowitz, who is here today, certainly the soul and conscience of the Montana Department of Fish, Wildlife, and Parks for several decades. It's good to see him still involved in these activities. I've been preparing to teach a course at USC this fall on public policy, and one of the books that I'm using for the class is John Kingdon's book on agenda formation. How do certain issues come to the forefront of the public agenda? And he describes problems, policies, and politics as sort of the circumstances which bring about substantial political change, substantial political action. Well, I think we've identified at this conference so far problems of the natural world, problems in the public lands. We're going to be talking about a lot of policies, and this new administration next year in the ensuing term, I think, provide the opportunity, the political opportunity for a step forward. I'll talk this morning about some of the problems and policies that are out there concerning water resource management. Matt was certainly, I think, wise to invoke the remarks of John Wesley Powell in his opening. Powell did address the Montana Constitutional Convention in 1889, and he urged the adoption of the watersheds as county boundaries. Montana members of the convention, along with Westerners elsewhere, they listened politely but ultimately ignored that advice and drew political boundaries on more traditional provincial economic and political considerations. Indeed, Montana and other western states have spent a century or more running away from the hydrologic realities of the region. First, the reality that precipitation is much lower west of the 100th meridian. The reality that most of the West is arid or semi-arid. The reality that we face flood and drought cycles. The reality that climate change further diminishes the certainty of reliable water supply. And the reality that there are limits to the growth of this region and the population and economy that our resources can support. From the late 1800s through most of the 20th century, Westerners could use and develop available water with little regard to the externalities that they might cause. These externalities included diminished stream flow with the attendant impacts upon aquatic life, pollution, and reduced water availability for those downstream and for future populations. However, for the last several decades, we have begun to pay the piper. We are forced to address these externalities, both in terms of mitigating past injuries and in developing new policies to reduce future externalities. Consensus building efforts in the areas of Indian water rights and in the recovery of threatened and endangered species provide some examples on how water resource conflicts can be addressed in ways that transcend artificial political boundaries. And perhaps these approaches in turn can inspire, as Bob has outlined, innovations on the public lands. This new era in water management has been driven by a series of major developments. First, a set of environmental statutes were enacted, both at the federal and state levels, providing the superstructure for addressing these injuries. Of course, there's the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, and its state analogs that now require governmental agencies to consider and document the environmental effects of certain projects. The Endangered Species Act applies the brakes to certain developments that threaten the survival or the habitat of threatened or endangered species. And the Clean Water Act has imposed water quality standards that constrain the alteration of navigable waters. Second, at the same time, a series of widely publicized incidents have caught the public attention, or at least the informed public, and aroused the need for more concerted action. The first days of the environmental movement were fueled by stories of the Cuyahoga River catching fire, resulting in the popular Randy Newman song, "Burn On, Big River." The movie Chinatown drew attention to the dewatering of the Owens Valley by the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power. The photographs of Ansel Adams and the work of the Sierra Club documented the great decline of Mono Lake, also by thirsty Southern California. Television programs on 60 Minutes surveyed the farming conglomerates that manipulated the Reclamation Act and transformed this populist legislation into a vehicle for corporate farming. Kesterson Wildlife Refuge demonstrated that wildlife was not necessarily protected on federal reserves from impacts of polluted irrigation return flows. And most importantly, the decline of the salmon and other fish in coastal rivers aroused Americans' concern about the survival of a national symbol of abundance and pride. Third, there's been the advent of economics. Economics has always been a consideration, I think, in water resource development, but it was used in a sort of a superficial way to use reclamation funds that were never would be repaid, and sort of false calculations of benefit and cost. But more recently, there has been a serious use of economics, the principles of efficiency, marginal cost, and the role of markets in resource allocation. Fourth, there's been a growing awareness, I believe, of the interconnections between our resources. The West individual spirit has always been overstated, as communities and other forms of cooperation were necessary for survival in often harsh conditions. In the case of water development, teams of horses, men, and equipment were often used to build water diversions and canals. Capital needed to be raised locally or on the national markets to build these structures. Eventually, governmental programs such as California's Right Act and the National Reclamation Act were necessary to fund the needed infrastructure. Water use was heavily dependent upon federal lands, the source of the watersheds, the Great Basins of the West, also the location for the early appropriations by trespassers, essentially, who became the cedar right holders throughout the West. Still, even in this period of growing reliance, water development could go forward with little regard for water users downstream in other states, for native populations settled on reservations, or for the environment. States could issue permits for water with little regard for the needs of other states. Outside of their community and surrounding region, water users did not appreciate the many connections with distant populations, ecosystems, and generations not yet born. A reality that both John Muir and Charles Wilkinson have described as bound fast by a thousand invisible cords. My thesis is that this era of water resource restoration is proceeding with a greater appreciation for these many relationships and interconnections. Water users are increasingly called upon to account for their externalities. No longer can the federal government or an individual state proceed on its own to develop and implement water policies without regard for downstream effects. Our evolving political and economic systems include so many actors, and so many of them have the ability to stall or veto the efforts of other actors. Hence, new decision-making processes and institutional reforms are necessary to transcend traditional boundaries and provincialism concerning water. While these approaches may alter the way we use water at the margin, they actually facilitate continued growth and urbanization of the West. It's impossible to speak in Missoula on this topic without recognizing the enormous contribution of Dan Kemmis, scholar and politician, to the role of community and connectedness in the West. Through his series of books, Kemmis has advanced the notion of geographically based community building. He argues that communities are relationships among people gathered around a place. When people gather as a community, they create something different and greater than themselves. According to Kemmis, they create the res publica, the public thing. The res publica includes the place, the mountains, the coast, the river, around which they unite. We are recognizing a growing number of examples of new resource management models framed around river basins and watersheds. The reasons for this development are, as we discussed, rivers and aquifers don't honor political boundaries. While much Western water development proceeded oblivious to this reality, regional classes over water use did appear very early in our history and required innovative solutions that transcended state boundaries. Starting in 1907, the conflict between Kansas and Colorado over the Arkansas River resulted in Kansas invoking the original jurisdiction power of the U.S. Supreme Court to bring the dispute before the court. The litigation resulted in the first equitable apportionment of an interstate river. The whole body of jurisdiction has developed after that case, guiding the resolution of interstate water disputes. However, a court decree, however thorough or important, is not a creative of a management entity to oversee the long-term management of the river. Seeking to avoid judicial distribution of interstate waters, the states pioneered the concept of interstate water allocation compacts. Foremost of these is the Colorado River Compact of 1922, which was eventually agreed to by the 7 basin states, including Arizona, California, Colorado, New Mexico, Utah, and Wyoming. The compact is a quantification agreement entered into by the states and approved by Congress. However, the compact itself does not create an administrative agency. But with the passage of the Boulder Canyon Project Act in 1928, Congress filled that vacuum and authorized the Secretary of Interior to be the water master for the basin. A more comprehensive example of the interstate compact approach is the Delaware River Basin Commission, approved by Congress and including the states of New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, as well as the United States as the chair of the commission. Effective in 1961, the compact provides a strong administrative structure. Its programs include water quality protection, water supply allocation, permitting, conservation initiatives, watershed planning, drought management, flood protection, and recreation. More importantly, innovative water resource regional forms of governance have appeared in many areas of the West. I'll discuss 2 of these, Indian water rights settlements, and secondly, regional accords and agreements stimulated by the Endangered Species Act. Indian water rights speak to, I think, option 4, issue number 4 of the National Advisory Committee's report in terms of settling water rights. Over 100 years ago, this past January, in the case of Winters versus the United States, which originated in Montana's Milk River area, the court recognized the principle of reserved rights for the tribes, a perpetual seniority of most tribal rights over non-Indian water users. For most of the last century, non-Indian development proceeded under the prior appropriation doctrine without recognition of these rights. But starting in the 1970s, tribal governments and the federal agencies were more assertive in protecting those rights. The period also corresponded with energy development pressures of the 1970s. As a result, 10 states commenced large cases called general stream adjudications, and the federal agencies and tribes asserted their rights in that context. That includes Montana's own statewide general stream adjudication. So common to all of these large adjudications has been outstanding large federal and tribal rights for large amounts of federal and tribal land in our states. These states all involve high transaction costs for all parties. The litigation of these cases, even after a quarter century, has been very tedious. But the cases have stimulated negotiations that have produced an impressive array of Indian water rights settlements. Almost 30 of these settlements have been finalized or pending approval. And this list does not include the growing list of settlements for other non-Indian federal lands, such as the Park Service Montana Compact protecting the geothermal features of Yellowstone National Park. The parties have used sort of 2 approaches to these settlements. Arizona represents one extreme where the state participates along with all the other water users and the federal agencies and tribes in negotiating settlements. By contrast, Montana represents an approach where a statewide commission negotiates with the federal agencies and the tribes. The most ambitious settlement so far has been that of the Gila River Indian community in Arizona. The Indian community has probably the most senior rights of the state, dating back to the settlement of the Hohokam along the Salt River many decades and centuries ago. In 2004, the negotiation of the Gila River Indian community ended with a congressional settlement that provided the tribe with over 600,000 acre-feet of water. The settlement has other provisions in terms of providing allocation of the Central Arizona Project among the state, tribes, and the federal agencies. The legacy of settlements such as the Gila River Indian community is significant. The tribes secure both legal title and quantification of their water rights, as well as financial resources for water and economic development. The water supply of many metropolitan areas such as Phoenix and Tucson are secured by these settlements through leases and other transfers. Some of the settlements include new regional governance structures that knit together state and federal and tribal laws with court decrees and conflict management institutions. And the states, tribes, federal agencies, and stakeholders have gained valuable experience working together and in many areas that acrimony has declined. But this settlement movement carries with it lingering uncertainties. With litigation, negotiation, and commoditization of the water, have negotiators distilled the essence of water out of the resource and altered our relationship with this valuable resource. I'll turn now to ESA recovery efforts, endangered species recovery efforts, which speaks to challenge 3 of the National Advisory Board's report, management structures. Like water, endangered species also don't respect political boundaries. Threatened and endangered species depend on broader ecosystem protection. Litigation on these issues has been contentious and has led to, I think, a redoubling effort by the federal agencies to bring about more conflict resolution approaches. California provides many examples of both successful and unsuccessful ventures. In 1994, the state and federal agencies, in consultation with agricultural, environmental, and urban stakeholders, negotiated the Bay Delta Accord. This accord announced new water quality standards for the Bay Delta area, which is northeast of San Francisco, and covered a wide range of issues, including salinity, flow requirements, and species protection. The agreement also created the CalFed program to manage a long-term restoration program for the area. But after millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars in several years, questions have been raised about the effectiveness of the program, and relationships have become frayed with some stakeholders. Still, as John Leshy said last night, these type of experiences provide good and bad experience that can inform future action. CalFed has provided many insights for large-scale environmental restoration. The San Joaquin settlement, which is within the last 2 years, also settles a contentious federal lawsuit that provides with congressional funding efforts to restore salmon and ecological recovery on that Central California river system. In the last 2 years, I've had the opportunity to chair a effort sponsored by the U.S. Institute for Environmental Conflict Resolution on the Missouri River. And it's been a very tedious, very preliminary effort to create the charter for a recovery committee that will guide a multi-year and probably a multi-billion-dollar recovery program by the Corps of Engineers and federal agencies. This is in response to the listing of 3 species under the Endangered Species Act. The whole effort was based on getting the tribes, the states, and the many stakeholders of the basin together to work out on a consensus basis the terms of a charter that will guide species recovery. That effort has been undertaken by the U.S. Institute for Environmental Cooperation, which is in Tucson under a contract with the Corps of Engineers. And I think it provides an example of how this sort of quasi-independent federal agency can be a catalyst in these type of resource conflicts. Let me close by sort of summarizing some of the principles I think that come out of these efforts, both on the Indian water rights side as well as the ESA side. First, I think there has been a change to the federalism paradigm. I grew up with the conception of sort of layered cake federalism, where there was local level, state, and federal government. More recent formulations of that have been sort of marble cake federalism. But I don't think that even is sufficient, and I suggest in my paper that it's maybe more like a Cuisinart form of federalism, where things are so mixed up between the public and private sector, between the levels of government, tribes included. So I think we are changing our understanding of how the federal system works, and it's very different from what our forefathers had charted. Second, I think there has been a change in geographic focus. I think we were thinking more along ecosystem boundaries, recognizing that we have to take ecosystem approaches and that we cannot let political boundaries interfere. Third, most of these efforts take place in the context of litigation. Sometimes the litigation precedes the activity or the settlement activity. Sometimes it is coterminous, but I think litigation is often necessary to move these efforts forward. Fourth, there's sort of the difficult challenge of assembling the necessary parties. On the Missouri, we had almost 75 people involved in the negotiations, representing 8 states, about 25 tribes, and a variety of stakeholders. So it's hard to get all the people to the table, but you need to get the people to the table so that they don't do end runs around your process later on. Fifth, there's been sort of the ascendancy of the consensus principle. It's very tedious to proceed on a discussion where people have to agree, or at least they have to say that they can live with the decision before something is affirmatively adopted. But that may be necessary to avoid further litigation and, again, preventing people from doing end runs around the consensus process. There's the long haul. These negotiations take many years to negotiate. The cast of characters change, issues change, so you have to be in it for a long period of time. As Bob has indicated in his fifth principle, science is important, and additionally, the understanding of risk is important. There's no risk-free choices out there, and we have to sort of have a better understanding of what risk means. Economics is having a greater role through marginal cost calculations and use of markets. These processes need, I think, in most cases, to be open for public scrutiny. The internet, the press, and public information laws make that necessary. But because these negotiations occur in such unique forums, they sometimes fly under the radar of public understanding. People really don't understand how these processes fit into their traditional understanding of government. Once settlements are arranged, they still face a complicated approval process that may involve getting state legislative approval, tribal approval, congressional approval, the consent of the administration, and so forth. Implementation, again, you have to be in for the long haul. The agreement is fine, but additional funding, continued funding is often necessary. So given these problems, why would anybody choose this method of decision making? The answer is that despite these constraints, this set of complex negotiations offers more promise in many cases than court or legislative resolution. These consensus building efforts sometimes build a long-term relationships among the parties that would not be possible and other conflict resolution efforts. I think new lawyers in the field will have to understand how these methods work, that skills other than litigation are going to be very necessary to work in this area. And that certainly is true of the federal officials for the new administration. They will need the confidence to convene large stakeholder groups and believe that collaborative processes often provide practical outcomes that have broader support and do indeed improve water management and the protection of species.
Very good. I hope folks can appreciate, I mean, the complexity. I mean, John, within less than a half an hour, really, to try and give us a snapshot of the multitude of lessons, really, related to governing and managing transboundary water resources. So there's a lot to draw from there as we sort of continue to push the envelope and think about experiments on the public lands and how some of those lessons might be transferred. Moving along, Jan Brown from the Yellowstone Business Partnership is going to talk some about the partnership and allow us then to sort of reflect on what role for the private sector, for businesses, and for NGOs in this context. So Jan, I'll get your PowerPoint.
Thank you. While we're getting that up, why don't you go ahead and look at page 6A under section D. I just named mine section A because it's kind of embedded there with John's speech. You may have found it as you were following along. I call it 6A. I have to tell you, I know a lot of you in the room, and we're all growing old together. I won't say that I just turned 50 because it was several years ago, but I got a great birthday card that had this lovely woman with a cake in front of her, and it said, "Now that you've reached this age, you can have your cake." And you open up the card and it says, "And wonder if you've had your cake." So if any of you heard this speech before or some of my jokes, please forgive. We're all growing old together. What I want to do today is actually build upon two things that both Bob and John have just said. One is the importance of relationships as we go forward with these different types of approaches and tools for integrated governance. Let me tell you, there's nothing that thrills me more to work in the nonprofit arena is that the relationships that you develop over time in this region. And I think those are more valuable than just about anything I can express. And I honestly think we do come to better decisions as a result of developing that mutual respect and the confidence that we can be trusting and sharing. The second thing is, I want you to imagine what two things that Bob said at different times during his talk. He said that they're operating within the shadow of the law, doing this kind of stuff, but we have to operate within the sideboards of the law. So imagine sideboards, and how are you going to get in the shadow when you're in sideboards? Does it mean the sun's coming up or it's going down on our efforts? Now, are we at the beginning still of this whole movement of doing things collaboratively, of bringing more people into the pool? Or is this on the sunset side? If we're in the shadow of the law and the law are the sideboards, I'd like to know we're operating in the middle there, and hopefully it's it's pretty wide and that the sun's going to be up on us for a while. All right, let's go. Now, I don't know if the light's good enough that you can see this from the back, but what I'm really showing here, and we don't have a laser pointer here, this is the moisture channel. And, we're talking about regions. Let's remember why Greater Yellowstone is so important to the West. And it has to do with the hot spot, and it has to do with the increase in elevation of the Greater Yellowstone Plateau brought about by calderas, by the rise in that whole mass, several thousand, over 1,000 to 2,000 feet uplift that basically stops the water flow coming up from this moisture channel up along the Snake Plain. What it results in, and those of you who've ever driven through Island Park, Idaho in a blizzard, know that it snows heavy and deep on that side of the Yellowstone Plateau. When it comes down to it, the water resources that we have and the habitats and the entire, the lodgepole forest, the wildlife, everything that goes on in the Yellowstone Plateau as a result of this uplift that captures the water. As you can see, 60 to 80 inches per year on that west side around Island Park, Tetons. I show this slide when I go to west of the Cascades to remind them it's not all desert, and there is moisture that is sinking down into the Snake Plain aquifer. And it's really, and we're running off into 3 different watersheds, as you know, the Missouri, Mississippi, the Green River, Colorado, and then the Snake, Columbia. Let's not forget just how important this ecosystem is for this entire region, not just the wildlife and those of us who live there. All right, what we consider the Yellowstone-Teton region is 25 counties. It's often 20 counties that's been noted for the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, but we consider 25 counties, including the major population centers, and I'll show you this shortly. But we're talking about 700,000 people who live in this ecosystem, and that doesn't include, of course, seasonal residents who aren't counted in the census, and doesn't count the visitors who come in droves, mostly in the summer months. Increasingly, this group is 45 to 65 years old, if that doesn't surprise us, and the growth in services is truly growing, exponentially in some cases, while agriculture, mining, and government employment's flat. Again, I don't know if you can see this very well, but these are the 25 counties. There's about 6 in Wyoming, very large geographically, 8 in Montana that we consider, including Yellowstone County, your largest, where Billings is, about 140,000 people there now. And then about 11 smaller counties in eastern Idaho, including towns of Idaho Falls and Pocatello. We have 4 metro areas, if you want to include counties as metro areas. That, of course, would be Yellowstone, Gallatin, Bonneville, and Bannock. None in Wyoming, at least in these counties. This helps you understand where the population concentration is. Again, 140,000 in Yellowstone County, up and around Billings. To the smallest county population-wise is Clark County, Idaho. Fewer than 1,000 people live in that county. So it's a wide disparity of population, resources. But what we found when we started our organization is that every one of these counties that I showed in the previous slide has a real fundamental relationship to Yellowstone and Grand Teton parks and identify with them. So why were we created? I mean, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the region as a whole, but I am going to talk about who YBP is and why we took some action in this arena. Most of our members were our businesses, and they wanted to have an organization because neither the chambers nor the environmental interests in the region served what they wanted to do, basically to preserve the health of the regional environment, to promote sustainable and prosperous economies, and to maintain the quality of life in their communities. Many consider that the triple bottom line. I would consider it using a word that Jed Emerson uses about blended value, or the blended bottom line. Basically, that you can't just separate these and call them a triple bottom line. These are integrated and contribute to the overall prosperity of a given business. We also knew that businesses needed to be informed to participate in various processes in the region, and they wanted a more collaborative and less adversarial approach to doing business when we talk about these complex issues. And so our mission, again, I'm assuming some of you can't see this, so let me just read it really quickly. We unite businesses that are dedicated to preserving a healthy environment and shaping a prosperous and sustainable future for communities in the Yellowstone-Teton region. More importantly, as we promote the scientific understanding, informed dialogue, and collaborative approaches that will get at resolving our region's most complex challenges. And I really emphasize complex. And that is because, number one, this is what most of the business are frustrated about, is that we seem to be not getting at the essential challenges that are affecting business. Things like unmanaged growth, things like the lack of a transportation system. We want to operate more sustainably, but how do we do it when we seem not to have the resources we need in some of these rural counties? There's real concern about the seasonality of our economies and how so many businesses, if they just had 10% more business in the off seasons, could perhaps keep on a full-time employee with benefits and really contribute to the prosperity of some of these small gateway communities. These are tough challenges that no one entity is going to deal with on their own. So these are the complex issues that we have been trying to tackle, essentially looking at rising energy prices and a real interest in operating green, more sustainable practices for business. We have a leadership program, a 2-year program that businesses can choose to enroll in that gives them not only information, but gives them a support system to implement changes back in their business with the support of a learning team. I'm not going to go into that program called Uncommon Sense, but it's a leadership program. I'd be happy to talk with those interested later. I'm going to talk more detail right now in this case study about the Greater Yellowstone Framework for Sustainable Development, but we also, as I mentioned, are looking at the challenge of seasonality in this region. I mean, like why do our parks close twice a year, for heaven's sakes? It really does, you begin to wonder what we could do as a region if we really looked at ourselves as a 4-season, I guess you'd say, community. And we want to give greater support to national parks and forests. I just wanted to say one thing about partnerships, and it's got to work both ways. Many of our businesses feel like when they hear the word partnerships from agencies, it means open your wallet or open the till. And a partnership simply got to work both ways. Businesses when we have an initiative, let me tell you, it's very hard to get the agencies to participate in our initiative. I mean, we get all sorts of initiatives from the government to participate in, but when we needed help with agencies on some of the challenges with this framework, we really had to beg. And I really think that's something to consider as far as integrating and collaborating our efforts, is that we've got to go both ways. So the Greater Yellowstone Framework for Sustainable Development came about basically almost 4 years ago now. We were asked by the Nature Conservancy to join them in an assessment of attitudes toward regional growth and change. We conducted about half of the 80 personal interviews that were done across the region with community leaders of all persuasions, all political views. And it was fascinating what came out. It didn't matter what your political persuasion was. Everyone said this place is growing too fast. We need to have better managed growth. And why can't someone develop a toolkit to do it? And this is folks who say, I don't want regulations, but I really want somebody to tell me how to do this better. And we're talking developers, elected officials, the whole gamut. So we said, okay, that's an interesting result. And the Nature Conservancy said, this is good, go at it, YBP. And so the Nature Conservancy helped us take all the information and then started to think, going off on our own, how we were going to address this challenge. So what we decided was to create a regionally relevant rating system based on the U.S. Green Building Council LEED model. And approached, well, let's keep going here. I won't go to the details. In 2007, we unveiled the framework thanks to about almost $200,000 in support, largely from the Murdoch Charitable Trust. And in 2008, we selected our pilots and publishing a technical reference guide. That's a quick summary. So in April of 2006, U.S. Green Building Council issued a letter saying they would provide staff support to us to develop a regionally relevant rating system for the Greater Yellowstone that included but went beyond the built environment. Many of you who are familiar with LEED know that it has raised the bar on the marketplace for building efficient buildings and developments. What this does is take a largely urban emphasis, I guess you can emphasis on LEED, and we found when we looked at all the certified buildings across the country, there was, at least 3 years ago, a big hole in the Northern Rockies. And part of that was because it was so urban oriented. And we said sometimes a green building can still be built in the wrong place, after all. And so let's really talk about how we can make this more regionally relevant and meaningful. So we basically started to develop ideas and credits for these areas of land use, of improved infrastructure and transportation, of biodiversity, community vitality, site-sensitive development, and certainly looking at recreation, cultural, historic values. All of those things were on the table. They assigned a staff person who was managing the Lead for Neighborhood Development project, and we went at it. What we did is we formed 6 design teams with approximately a total of 80 members. Some were core team members, some were consulting team members based on their time and availability to help. But it truly was a collaborative process over 9 months. We hired facilitators, and they met separately. They had monthly conference calls. We had a kickoff meeting down in Jackson, and then wound up with a Chico meeting in Chico. Notice how we go to nice places. But anyway, the Cultural Historic Group included folks from the Yellowstone Historic Center, and they stood by the yellow bus for their point of view. It's real interesting. LEED never did tackle culturally or historic appropriate architecture and construction in their rating system. And we said, oh, why not? It's important to this region. It's who we are. So cultural and historic values are integrated. What we did is, after writing all the prerequisites and the total of 57 credits, we went through each one I facilitated an all-day session of trying to get 80 people to say, all right, thumbs up, thumbs down, sideways, on how some of these things were worded by the different design teams. You can imagine that we had different authors, different ways of emphasizing points. So it was truly synthesized. It was hard to integrate. All right, I'm trying to go fast. Here's just a picture of us at Chico. What we wound up doing is unveiling this draft rating system at our annual conference in May of 2007. We got a panel of community leaders. The city manager of Bozeman's in there, Gary Christensen, who's the owner of the Banner Bank building in Boise. Some of you may know it was the first platinum core and shell building I think in the United States, or the second one anyway. And everyone talked about what incentives and marketing needs there would be to try to advance this rating system across the region. So let's take a look at what's in there. If you look at the rating system, the scorecard that's in your document, pages 6B and C, you'll see that this is laid out in credit categories. And the way the rating system works is that you must do the 7 prerequisites, and then you have a choice of taking credits that your development can meet and to try to achieve the highest point score possible. That's how a rating system is done. And in the LEED system and in ours, you will require third-party verification that this is done if you're going to have a certified development in Greater Yellowstone. So this is just a breakdown. What's really relevant to the public land interests here probably are biodiversity, cultural and historic values, and recreation resources. And very quickly, just be aware that what we've done in recreation resources, there's a credit called carrying capacity, and we're asking developers, even if they're not adjacent to the public land, to calculate the impact of their development on the nearby or the proximate public lands, whether it's trails or dispersed recreation. And then based on their projected impact, and this is calculated in cooperation with the agency that they must work with, to develop mitigating or contributing facility improvements, that kind of thing, even if it's not on their property. So the whole idea here is to recognize that development will have an effect on public lands, and that you will get credits for working with the public resource agency that's close by. I know you can't see this, so I'm just trying to give you a sense of the 7 prerequisites and what they really try to achieve. And I think it complements things you've already heard about that need to be advanced in this region in the 21st century. Obviously, every developer should be doing an asset inventory. We're finding out, of course, that not all developers know what they have when they're developing, but we want, as a prerequisite for a complete asset inventory to be done, and a statement of a spirit of place to have every developer say what's unique about that property that they're about to develop. That's a prerequisite. So they display an understanding of what kind of resources, cultural, natural, whatever, are going to be effective as they proceed. Coexisting with wildlife is a prerequisite in our in our framework. It's just critical that animal attractants be properly contained, that we eliminate private feeding of wildlife, and that within bear recovery areas there's some additional requirements. Our intent, of course, is to advance practices that minimize conflict and to promote more harmonious coexistence. There is a bunch of built environment credits in here, by the way. LEED prerequisites have to be met for whatever project is closest to the development being proposed. If it's a subdivision for homes, then LEED homes prerequisites have to apply. And we give guidance on, of course, what that means, but it has to do with making sure that construction materials are recycled rather than going to the local landfill, energy efficient, kind of non-smoking kind of things are happening on the property, that kind of thing. Really going fast. Someone said, why would code compliance have to be a prerequisite? Don't people have to obey the law? Well, we put it as a prerequisite. It's a gentle reminder that in many counties in our region there aren't code enforcements. And there may be codes, but they're not enforced. And we're just saying, let's try to follow the International Building Code or the International Energy Code, whatever's on the books. Water metering is our other requirement, and we're saying that no matter where you are, you ought to meter your water. There's plenty of cities, including Idaho Falls, that still don't, that it's a flat fee for your water use. And it's still, I don't care if it's groundwater or whatever, this whole group had the consensus that any new development should be metering their water and know their use. Everyone has to do a transportation plan, understanding what they can do to advance alternative forms of transportation to encourage safe pedestrian and bike travel. And finally, the seventh prerequisite is community engagement, and we want folks to go well beyond the minimum permit requirements of any land use authority, but to truly engage all of the parties who would be affected to gain from the wisdom and experience of the region. Okay, I'm doing okay, racing through. We're in our pilot phase right now, and so very quickly I want to just show you the kind of folks who have stepped up to pilot test this framework. Now you might say, who in the world would want to do this, and why? Well, number one, in a very tight market, folks are looking for about any advantage that they can get to say, I'm a certified GY framework development. What's also interesting is that folks really think that they can learn and grow through this. I don't think anyone ought to look at developers as solely only looking at the financial bottom line. There are people who are developing in this region who do care, and I hope they're in our membership, quite frankly. But when it comes down to it, we need to give the tools to the folks who really want to do the right thing, and that's what this is about. We have the Beartooth Nature Center in Red Lodge, Montana, and Dornix Park in Big Timber, Montana, who are both small, they're both nonprofit citizen committees basically trying to raise money for their projects, and they're seeing their involvement as a registered pilot project as a way of actually raising funds. Harriman State Park in Idaho and Allen Park, believe it or not, Idaho State Parks were involved in development of this framework. They had state permission to do so, and now they're piloting this with the renovation of some of their historic buildings. And finally, Red Lodge and Livingston High Schools are both, one's under construction right now, one's in the planning phase, but both high schools are interested in demonstrating this framework. That's the Boulder River. And that's the Henry's Fork, just so you can get your bearings. All right, we have several resorts. One is Grand Targhee. Many of you know Grand Targhee Resort has been very controversial over the years. They are stepping up to demo this project, this framework, as well as Mountainside Village, which is a mixed-use, kind of traditional neighborhood design in Victor, Idaho, and Story Mill neighborhood in Bozeman, which is also a lead for neighborhood development pilot. Just so if you want to know, this is what's coming, snow. But you need to know that Grand Targhee has 36 conditions for which they have to act in far as developing 450 units at the base now of that ski hill. So we hope we can really help them, and they can help us make sure that this framework is really relevant and that we show what can be done. Finally, we have some subdivisions. Teton Meadows Ranch is the one that's right now currently under moratorium in Jackson Hole. Was trying to do a middle income gap housing idea for folks who made too much money for affordable housing but not enough to afford $1.2 million average house costs. And so, you know, but it's caught up now in real snags, but we encourage them to be a pilot regardless. Okay, YBP is the kind of organization that people join not for marketing, but to network with businesses that have similar values and to contribute on task forces like this to come away with things that will actually help the region as a whole. We found our businesses really want to learn more about their heritage, about the socioeconomic trends and challenges we have, and basically influence how the region develops and maintains its overall quality of life. That was a fast commercial, wasn't it? Some of you are perhaps in organizations or in businesses, or maybe, really could use more law firms in our organization, actually. But I just want to say that this has been one of the most interesting challenges we faced, is to actually design a framework for sustainable development that has real promise to inspire, and you might say, lift the market up from just what's minimally required in our land use planning. I think most of you know that land use planning is optional in Montana and Wyoming. It's really, Idaho's the only one with its local land use planning act of 1976 that requires every county and town to plan. Doesn't mean it's all enforced. John nods his head. But the point is, it's true. And we do have an opportunity now to obviously follow all of the laws on the books and codes on the books, but to even do better. And that's what our program is about. I do appreciate the invitation, and I certainly hope we can answer some questions in our last 10 minutes. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Jan, and thanks to all of our panel members again. We do have about 10 minutes before lunch, so I believe there are some law students with microphones. If folks have comments or questions, just raise a hand. Here's one up here. Several around there.
Is that working?
That's working.
I'd just like to ask all the panelists, and thank you very much for your presentations, which were very good, about water management in relation to what you individually talked about. One of the problems I see around us all the time is that existing water users, especially large users like agricultural irrigation, do not pay for what they use in almost all Western states, if not all. They often pay for the cost of administering the cost of a water master to direct water through an irrigation canal system, but the states never charge for the use of the water itself. And that seems to me within the prerogative of each state to do in order to encourage conservation of water from the largest users, which are always agricultural users. And I think of this in terms of what Jan just said about encouraging metering of water and presumably charging appropriately. And how do we get that for agriculture?
Okay. John, can you address that quickly?
I think it's certainly a valid point that states do have the authority, I think, to impose that type of charge. It obviously would be politically unpopular in large parts of the West. The reverse side, of course, is to build more incentives into the water allocation system, and California and other states have done a lot of that by allowing conservation to proceed on farms, with the farmers able to sell the conserved water to urban areas or other users and benefit in that way. Jan's comments remind me of sort of a related issue. In California, there is something called the California Urban Water Conservation Council, which started as by some of the municipal water providers, large water users, who developed a whole set of conservation standards and other providers can sign up to participate in the program. They pledge to meet the standards. They report annually on how much water they're saving in the implementation of those standards. I think that's another positive effort that can go a long way toward conservation.
Okay. Another question? Yeah, Jack.
It seems to me that whether we're talking about biological sustainability or collaboration or economic sustainability or transboundary water issues, to sort of steal a phrase, a river runs through it. And it seems to me that the prior appropriations doctrine at its heart is not collaborative, it's not ecologically sustainable, and I'm wondering if any of you want to put that doctrine on the table when we're talking about moving into the 21st century and ways that we can reach these very laudable goals that all of you have talked about.
I think in many parts of the West, the prior appropriation doctrine is alive only on paper and not really in practice. There's not a lot of enforcement in seniorities by many states, and I think the doctrine is being superseded by water management agreements, like some of which we've talked about today, which are more practically based and more equitable. So I think the doctrine has been substantially modified in practice. I don't think it is the obstacle that it was in the past. I think people in communities are working out ways to bring about more effective and fair water management.
Okay. Another question? There's a couple right up here, up front.
I have a simpler question than Jack's. For Jen Brown, primarily, do you anticipate adopting the standards in the GY framework through adoption of local zoning or building codes standards, or a system of incentives for people to do this beyond just kind of general market incentives, which I recognize are there, but that's going to be pretty minor compared to the overall economy?
Right. This is a voluntary system, first and foremost, and we have a variety of financial and insurance and energy institutions working with us right now to fashion incentives that can help our pilots first and foremost, and then be incorporated into the ultimate program. Various types of mortgage instruments. It seems like a good time to experiment there. And, you know, banks as well, trying to figure out how to have buildings that last. When it comes down to it, though, we've actually had Bozeman and taking a serious look at the framework as a possible option that would provide a kind of a fast tracking, bypassing a very long drawn out process perhaps. If someone agrees to do this and there are checks along the way, that a developer perhaps could then adopt this and get approval through the local planning office. You know, it seems to me that one of the pilots we ought to be doing is demonstrating this as it applies to municipalities, state and federal governments also. I would love to see the Old Faithful new education center meet this standard, for example, in the park. So incentives right now, we're a little hesitant to say it should be the law, the code, without any other options, because we really think the voluntary approach fosters creativity and a lot of innovation.
Another question up front here.
Hello. Hi, thank you for your talk. I appreciate what everyone said. This is primarily for Professor Kiter. Professor Kiter, in the outline you mentioned the role of law, and I applaud your use of your discussion of the law and sideboards, but you mentioned legitimacy, fairness, and accountability. So I'm concerned about what you mean by legitimacy, but before I get into that, I want to put this in context and take us back to the mid-'80s when there was a discussion in a paper by Bernard Mann and it was entitled On Legitimacy and Deliberation. And a couple years later, Cass Sunstein wrote a paper, Beyond Republicanism, but he meant by that not the republicanism of politics, but political theory and deliberative democracy in many respects. So are you discussing sort of a theory of deliberative democracy as a pragmatic application? And is that what you mean by legitimacy? Because what I've heard discussed has to do with deliberative democracy, the principles of deliberative democracy. Let me speak loud. Deliberative democracy, is this what you mean by legitimacy, as opposed to political liberalism, or the idea that politics is equivalent or functions like a market? So if you could just perhaps put some teeth on what you're talking about when you reference legitimacy in your outline, that would help.
Yes. I am thinking in terms of deliberative democracy, as I understand that phrase. And that is that what we have is a sort of loose legal framework in place currently that sets up a variety of, I guess, of standards that govern the public lands. The laws that come to mind, I don't think I mentioned them when I was speaking. I'm sure you're all familiar with them, include the Endangered Species Act, the National Forest Management Act, in particular the biodiversity provision, and at least the old biodiversity regulations. The National Environmental Policy Act, a process law, but nonetheless one that requires agencies to take a broad, or if you will, sort of cumulative effects look at the impact of planning and management decisions. And it was sort of the combination of those laws and some other ones that came together to provide a bit of a legal framework for the early ecosystem management initiatives that several of which I talked about during the course of the talk. I think that provides a bit of a framework. I think ultimately we're going to need more than that in the way of substantive standards. But at least within that framework, I guess what I envision in talking about collaborative conservation is groups of people with an interest in a place, more broadly a landscape, operating within that framework to devise and make at least planning recommendations. Ultimately, another important legal principle to keep in mind here is that on the public lands, final decision-making cannot be turned over from the land management agency to an ad hoc group, at least not unless Congress authorizes that sort of thing. So I'm not sure that's directly responsive, but that's sort of the framework within which I perceive this sort of innovative marriage of ecological sustainability concepts and collaborative conservation concepts coming together to begin with. And I think everyone referred to this, see this period as sort of transitional and experimental. And I think we're learning as we're going. And at the end of the day, and I don't know if that's 5 years, 10 years, or 50 years, I see a new set of laws emerging out of that governing the public lands. I can't tell you exactly what they are at this point, but that's where I see things headed.
Thank you, Bob. I think there's at least one more. Go ahead. Back.
Can you hear me?
Can't now.
I'd like to follow up on that. Further discuss.
You might just stand. Can you just stand up and speak loudly,
Yeah,
please?
I'll try to speak loudly. Could you just follow up on the idea of the sideboards that you were mentioning about what the public land law would look like that would be a merger or a marriage of ecological management and collaboration, and does multiple use provide for that? Does the multiple use law, so we have to provide for that? Or like the others have discussed this morning, would that need to be changed?
The very short answer, I think, is we need ultimately some clearer guidance from Congress and some hard decisions being made, setting some priorities among the multiple uses. Whether in this day and age that can be done universally through an amended Organic Act, for example, or whether as an alternative that's going to end up being done on a place-basis, if I can put all those words together, I think remains to be seen. I think we are seeing a lot of sort of place-based initiatives, some of which have been alluded to last night and currently, and some of you may well be involved in some of those initiatives here in Montana and elsewhere that ultimately seem to be headed toward some sort of congressional ratification that this is a new set of standards for managing this place, whether it's the Boulder White Clouds in Idaho, the Oahe, Washington County in southwestern Utah, the Beaverhead Deer Lodge negotiations I know just a little bit about here, and I think there are some other initiatives, and we've already got on the books the Southern Nevada legislation and some other place-based legislation there, Steens Mountain, you can go on and on, and that may end up being an alternative way to establish these sideboards that I alluded to. But at the end of the day, I think Congress is going to have to face up to some clarification of priorities among the multiple uses.
Okay, very good. Before Michael gives us directions for lunch, can we give a round of applause for